Today we talk about the game that comes with Battles magazine, issue number 7. Battles, to me, still the best word game magazine out there. Such a great read, just number 1 to me, no doubt. The game, Growling Tigers, covers the Battle of Changde, a battle that took place in China in World War II between Japanese and Chinese, and it was a battle that took place for control of the city of Changde, so defended by the Chinese and attacked by powerful Japanese units. That was a nasty attack from the Japanese that used chemical weapons, and this is represented in the game by gas attacks. In the game, the Japanese player has very strong units, and that's a huge advantage, and on the other hand, the Chinese player that has weaker units will have to use other factors such as terrain and supplies in order to be able to balance things a little bit. So this is a game that presents the players with different challenges, and the Chinese player will have to be creative if he is to survive until the end of the game. Also, I played the game using magnetic counter holders. These are holders that you can buy online. You literally slip the counters in the holders, and then you can attach the holders to a magnetic board. You also attach the paper map to the board, and you can play the game vertically, and I think that the game looks pretty cool this way. Also, in this way you can move the game around, and it is easy to store. You don't lose, well, the last move that you play. Very convenient. So since I played the game in this fashion today, I'm going to review the game in its magnetic version. This is the map, printed on paper with the city of Changde in the middle, and with this big river here, which is mostly impassable. It can be passed only at the forts, which are represented by these lines here. And you have a net of roads that exit the map, and the exit hexes of the roads represent supply sources for both players. This is the setup, and at the beginning of the game, only the Chinese player has units on the map. The Japanese player will bring in that group of units in turn 1. Those units can enter from this edge here or from that edge there. And in turn 2 and 3, these are the two groups will enter from these two edges of the map. Starting from turn 4, it is the Chinese player that receives reinforcements. All of those chits there represent different groups, and the Chinese reinforcements, represented by these blue units here, will enter from these sides here, from these edges here. So what you have here is a little bit of a complicated situation, sort of like concentric situation, in which you will have a group of the Chinese defenders here, more or less in the middle of the map. The original defenders may choose to slow down the advance of the Japanese units as much as possible, or they may decide to withdraw in Changde and set up that main defense there. And then around those units you will have probably a line of Japanese units, and around those then you have the reinforcements that the Chinese player will bring later, and those reinforcements will have a chance to cut supply lines of the Japanese player. This is pretty important. In fact, supply rules are pretty strict here. You can draw supply lines only on roads and or villages and or forts, and roads are interrupted by the presence of enemy units and or enemy zones of control. That means that for the reinforcements of the Chinese player, it's pretty easy to cut supply lines of the Japanese player, unless the Japanese player decides to leave some units behind precisely to protect supply lines. But if that happens, that means that the attack against the city of Changde is, of course, weakened. Less units are going to be available to press against Changde. All this comes together beautifully, when you learn about the victory conditions. The Japanese player wins the game if he has control of the city of Changde, that is, if he is the only player to have units in Changde by the end of turn 8 or at the end of any turn. If that happens at the end of any turn, that is instant victory for the Japanese player. The Chinese player wins the game if he prevents that from happening, so if he still has control of Changde by the end of turn 8, or if he manages to bring in even just one unit of his reinforcements into the city of Changde. At the beginning of a turn, players may have to resolve special events. There are special events scheduled to happen on the turn track from turn 4 to turn 8. Then players roll on a table to determine the number of tactical chits that they draw. Each player has an individual pool of tactical chits. This is the pool for the Japanese player, and the number of chits drawn varies from turn to turn, and these chits can be played in various moments of the turn depending on the type of chit, and they will grant different types of advantages. For example, gas attack reduces the strength of the units in the hex in which that chit is played. Banzai allows the Japanese player to execute a particularly powerful attack, but that may backfire. The Japanese units may get hurt in case the target units are not eliminated. Infiltration allows to ignore a zone of control during movement, so there are different types of things that can be done. Then the players also roll to determine the number of air power units that they draw. Again, each player has a different pool, and they may draw a dummy. Well, too bad, but the opponent doesn't know that that's a dummy. Or they can draw a fighter. Fighters have a bonus here, which can be used when the fighter is used to support air combat, but the fighters may also be used for something else, that is to escort bombers. Oh, look at this. In fact, you may have bombers. The player may draw a bomber, and bombers will be used during the initial phase of the turn of the active player. At the beginning of a player's turn, the active player can use barrage attacks. That is, artillery units on the map can launch barrage attacks, and then they can also use air power during that initial phase of their active player turn. Bombers can be committed in this phase to attack hexes on the map, and the active player, the attacker, can also use fighters to escort the bombers. The defender, the non-active player, can commit fighters. At this point, they reveal, the two players reveal their chits and resolve the effects. If you have a bomber of the attacker that goes unopposed by the opponent, then the bomber resolves an attack against the target hexes. If the defender has committed a fighter and the attacking bomber doesn't have an escort, then the bombing mission is cancelled. If the bomber is escorted by a fighter, then you have a combat between the two fighters of the attacker and the defender. There is a very simple procedure to resolve that, and then depending on the result, you will know whether or not you also resolve the bombing mission, or whether the bombing mission is going to be cancelled. Next, players alternate activating groups, a group at a time. Units in the activated group can move up to their movement allowance, which is of course represented by the number at the bottom right of the counter. Movement is affected by terrain and by enemy zones of control. Each unit projects a zone of control in the 6-axis around it. When a unit enters an enemy zone of control, it must stop immediately. Not only that, but units also spend an extra movement point to enter an enemy zone of control, and if they don't have enough movement points, they cannot enter it. This is pretty important for the Chinese player, who must try to take advantage of that as much as possible. In fact, if that rule is exploited well by the Chinese player can prevent the Japanese player from advancing too fast, of course, but also from getting adjacent to his own units, which will prevent the Japanese units from attacking, and of course that will keep the Chinese units healthy for a little longer. After movement, the active player can launch attacks with any and all of his active units that are adjacent to enemy units. Standard procedure: you compute the combat odds between the total attack factor of the attacker and the total defense factor of the defender. You find the right column, roll 2 dice, and apply the results. The result on the left of the slash applies to the attacker, and that is the number of step losses that have been inflicted on the attacker. The result on the right is applied to the defender. The first point of damage that the defender receives must be paid for with a step loss, but the second or third point of damage may be replaced by a retreat. All units of the defender must retreat from the target hex, and this is an option that is never open to the attacker. After combat, you have exploitation movement. Units of the active group that did not attack can move again up to half of their movement allowance. Very important if you're trying to cut supply lines, maneuver around enemy units, or to reconstruct and preserve supply lines. Then you do check for supplies, and lack of supply may inflict step losses on units or may disorganize units. You check for isolation, a unit completely cut off by enemy units and or zones of control loses a step. You have a replacement phase during which players can use supply points to recover step losses, and you check for victory conditions, and at the point the turn is over and you start next turn, same sequence of events, new reinforcements entering the game, possibly new special events starting from turn 4, and yes, you go through the same sequence of events with more action, more fighting, more combats, more death and glory in Changde, and around Changde, of course. This is a game that presents interesting challenges for both sides, and it is a game that has a very strong architecture, a very strong story. You always start with a slower phase in which the Japanese are mounting their attack and the Chinese are mounting their defense, and they have to choose where they're going to take their stand. The first 4 turns are sort of like introduction to the main action. Then when the Chinese reinforcements enter the game, then the action really becomes interesting and intense. Then you will have the fight in and or around Changde that will have started, and that is a brutal meat grinder for both players. You really have this sense of this merciless attrition that is going to reduce the units of both players slowly but painfully. And then you have the fight around the city, fight to defend the supply lines, to restore them, to cut them, of course. Probably there will be a fight, there may be a fight to prevent Chinese units from outmaneuvering the Japanese ones and entering the city. But then the road net is very limited, so maneuvers that are too far from the road either require long lines of units that extend the supply line, or require taking a chance of having your units suffering damage because they move too far from supply sources. There definitely are challenges, there definitely are interesting events and interesting ways in which you can coordinate the action. One negative aspect probably is replay value. Yes, I am a little bit worried about this. I do not know that I will play this game very often in the future, or I don't even know if I will play it in the future at all, just because the story is so strong. And this is a good thing on one hand, because it gives the game so much identity, so much flavor. But on the other hand, the story tends to present itself more or less the same game after game. Yes, you can change things around and test different things, but the overall experience really tends to be very similar from game to game, and that of course becomes a limitation after a while. But this being said, does it mean that if I don't play the game in the future, I lose all the fun and all the enjoyment that I already had? Certainly not. I had that fun and I'm glad I had it. Then you also have the magazine, which is such a nice read, good content, very good images, very pleasant to look at, very pleasant to hold, just good printing, good quality, good everything, top-notch magazine. So when you put together the game and the magazine, this is definitely a good package. I enjoy playing the game. I think it is a fun game. It got me to know a battle that I knew absolutely nothing about. I played this game, which is an interesting puzzle from both sides. So looking at either perspective, you have interesting situations to deal with. Again, definitely good game. Definitely good magazine. If you're not too worried about replay value, this is a good package and definitely one that left me with a good impression.